Hi there and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom. My name's Adrian Goldberg. I'm an investigative journalist and West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, and joined as usual by Charlie Methven. Charlie is a former director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, has been an advisor to both Arsenal and Spurs, and was a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time Charlie's playoff mania. Two of his former clubs, Charlton and Sunderland, are in the playoffs at Wembley. Before that, on Friday, his new club, and we'll talk about that in some detail, Mount Pleasant in Jamaica, where he is now the managing director, are also in the playoffs. So can Charlie pull off a unique playoff hat trick, and what are the implications of success or failure for all three? And Crystal Palace have won their first major trophy. Well done to them, the FA Cup. The last three teams from what we might term outside the elite to win the tournament were Leicester in 2021, Wigan Athletic in 2013, and Portsmouth in 2008. All three dropped out of the Premier League afterwards, a record which suggests that Eagles fans should milk the moment and enjoy it while they can. Can they beat that unfortunate trend? Welcome, Charlie. You're globetrotting. You're in Jamaica. I've got to tell you, before we hear about that, I've just got a bit of a boast. I've been to East Germany. I've been to Berlin and got the pennant from the final season of the GDR, the East German League. And I saw a game at a very interesting club who cling tightly to their East Berlin identity, Dynamo Berlin. I'll talk more about Dynamo Berlin and German football on another occasion, but this is a club who were once the most feared club in East Germany, now playing at the fourth tier of German football, but still pulling in, by my estimate, 5,000 or 6,000 fans for a meaningless end of season game. So real passion there. And you now, Charlie, are in Jamaica. So tell us about your new job at Mount Pleasant and playoff fever, whether that's grabbing Jamaica.
Well, yeah. Hello, Adrian. As you can probably tell from behind me, I'm no longer globe-trotting. I'm actually settled in a place in a different part of the globe, which is here in Jamaica. And I've become managing director of Mount Pleasant, which is the leading club here in Jamaica and in the Caribbean region. Now, the way in which the Jamaican system works, which is not entirely to Mount Pleasant's benefit, I have to say, is that rather like in American sports, winning the league doesn't win you anything, which is unfortunate for Mount Pleasant because they won the league by 18 points. It qualifies you to go into the playoffs. And rather like in the National League, the conference in the UK, the top two teams qualify automatically for the semi-final. And then the next four teams play off in the quarterfinals to decide who plays the top two teams in the semi-final. So last night at the at Sabina Park, actually not the National Stadium, Sabina Park, the old cricket stadium in Kingston, Mount Pleasant was playing against Montego Bay United in the semi-final of the playoff. And it was a tight game, to say the least, which we did the best we possibly could to throw at Montego Bay, but held out in the end for a doughty 2-1 win, which completed an extraordinary week of playoff semi-final success for teams I either am or have been recently associated with, because Charlton won through late in their playoff semi-final against Wycombe Wanderers, 1-0 on aggregate, with a goal, about 10 minutes before the end at the Valley, and that happened. I was there just before I came out here, and then, of course, a day or two before that, Sunderland had, in the most dramatic of circumstances, had beaten Coventry City to get to the Championship playoff final. So I now have an extraordinary situation where this coming weekend, Mount Pleasant play their playoff final against Cavaliers of Kingston in the National Stadium on Friday night, Jamaican time, which is Saturday morning, early Saturday morning, UK time, followed by later on that day, Sunderland's playoff final against Sheffield United, followed the following day by Charlton's playoff final against Orient. So in the space of less than 3 days, I have three playoff finals to look at.
Amazing stuff. Now, we might understand some of what is at stake for Sunderland in terms of getting into the Premier League and what Charlton might gain from being in the Championship. What's in it for Mount Pleasant to become Jamaican champions?
Well, actually, funny enough, the big thing really, other than glory, the big thing has been done. The top two teams, the finalists in the playoffs, qualify automatically for something called the Caribbean Cup. The Caribbean Cup is played from mid to late August through until November, December. November, in fact, I think. And it is the qualifying tournament, the regional qualifying tournament for the CONCACAF Champions Cup, which is the equivalent of the Champions League for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So that Caribbean Cup is a qualifying tournament of only 10 teams, which represents the professional leagues of the Caribbean, the foremost of which is the Jamaica Premier League. But there are also professional leagues in Haiti, Suriname, Trinidad, who also supply teams to the Caribbean Cup. And there are two pools of 5 teams. The winner of each of those pools goes automatically through to the CONCACAF Champions Cup, and indeed the winner gets a bye through to the last 16. And then the third place team has a subsequent playoff for a third spot in the CONCACAF Champions Cup, playing against a team from Central America. So essentially, last night was our cup final in terms of getting through to the crucial qualifying tournament. And our job now is to win our pool of 5 in the Caribbean Cup. And that then gets you through to some quite interesting situations. I've instituted something here already called, Operation Azteca, because there's every possibility that you end up playing Cruz Azul at the Azteca in front of 100,000 people. And that's a psychological thing that a club from the Caribbean needs to get its head around before it happens. In fact, Mount Pleasant's great rivals here, Cavaliers from Kingston, they went straight to the last 16 of the CONCACAF Champions Cup this season just gone, and ended up playing against Inter Miami over 2 legs, with Messi and Suarez scoring the winning goals in a match that was broadcast all around the world with huge commercials around it. So that's the sort of the immediate thing. And then the CONCACAF Champions Cup in turn is a feeder tournament for the FIFA Club World Cup. And the teams that do best in the CONCACAF Champions Cup over a 3 to 4 year rolling period then qualify for the 4 places that CONCACAF have in the Club World Cup. And these things are obviously pie in the sky. They're some way off in the distance, but they are actually genuinely things that can be achieved, and part of the reason why I've come to this part of the world.
Yeah, you spoke to us before about the possibility of making the Club World Cup and what a game changer that could be for the game in Jamaica. Just give us a sense of what Mount Pleasant is like. How many people turn up for a Mount Pleasant game? Are they the best supported team in the Caribbean? What is their realistic potential in that part of the world?
Well, so it doesn't work quite that way. Mount Pleasant is actually a startup club. Most of the clubs here are historic clubs, but Mount Pleasant was founded actually as an academy. Its actual official name is Mount Pleasant Football Academy, and its main purpose is to be the first fully professional Super Elite academy in the whole Caribbean region. There has not been a European-style academy here until now, and Mount Pleasant is the first designed to be that way. So it's a campus with a residential boarding school for 70 elite footballers who come from all over the Caribbean region, from Haiti, from Trinidad, Suriname, Curacao, all these places. Indeed, got our first 2 players in this week from Panama. So that was the original purpose of the club, and effectively the first team grew out of that and started to do well in its own right, and started to challenge the big Kingston clubs and Montego Bay, who are the clubs who have traditionally been the powerhouses over here, and eventually have ended up surpassing them and have won the league the last couple of years, and obviously in the playoff to win the trophy this year. So to a degree, I think sort of the usual attendance for a Mount Pleasant home game would be something like 2,000 to 3,000, something like that. The big Kingston club, Arnett Gardens, would be much more towards 10,000 in Trenchtown. And then last night at Savannah Park, it was a huge crowd. I mean, I can't tell you the exact number right now, but it was a big stadium packed out. So it's not a huge population here. It's 3 million population, and it's a professional league of 14 clubs. So there are natural limitations in terms of what your ultimate crowd size are going to be, but that's not really the driver. The key drivers are qualification for CONCACAF, and selling players. Developing and selling players, and that's the main reason why we're here. Even if you get a bigger crowd, you're never realistically going to be able to charge huge ticket prices in this part of the world. So that's always going to be a slightly lesser part of what we do.
Yeah, so the creation of the club really then was a business proposition to harness the ability of the best players in the Caribbean. Obviously creates an opportunity for those young players if they're able to go and ply their trade abroad, and also for the club owners then the ability to make money out of spotting the potential and developing the potential of these young people.
Yeah, that's right. It was founded by a man called Peter Gould, who's lived out here for a while, but is English, and his business is a UK-based business. And he, in a previous life, was part of Ken Bates's Chelsea. So was heavily involved in Chelsea in those days. And effectively, once he came over here, he decided almost as a passion project to found the academy. That then developed into something, as you say, more systematized and more project-based over the last 10 years. And the first team then grew out of that. So it's been an amazing project. And anyone who is in the area, I encourage you to get in touch. Come and see us. We're not far from in fact, we're right in between the holiday hotspots of Montego Bay and Ocho Rios on the north coast of Jamaica. It's a grand place to be, but it's a big project ahead, huge project ahead over the next few years to get this absolutely to where it needs to be.
Yeah, well, as my trip to East Germany demonstrated, I wasn't there entirely for the football, but wherever I am in the world, I try and take in a game. But football tourism is a growing industry. So football tourism
Indeed.
In Jamaica, I think that's definitely got a bit of potential as well. Let's talk about your other two former league clubs then in England, Sunderland and Charlton. Charlton, I mean, you tell me, Charlie. Charlton, I would say, are well capable of going up to the Championship and have a 26,000 capacity stadium or thereabouts. And I would say if they can go up, the Championship would hold no fears for them. Whereas Sunderland, if they were to overcome Sheffield United, I think my sense is, although they have a massive stadium, Sunderland are not yet, it would seem to me, even though they're not a bad team, they're not quite at the level where they could expect to survive, certainly not easily in the Premier League. And that in their case, it might be a case of banking the money, continuing to build the club, but perhaps accepting the inevitable hit of relegation.
Well, to take them one by one, Charlton are in a very good place. They obviously have to win the playoff final, but over the last half of the season, from December until May, Charlton actually picked up the most points in the division of any club, including Birmingham. So they were the top club in the division from December until May, with pretty much the youngest team as well. So you've got a young, dynamic team who are improving all the time, a manager who is a proven top Championship manager. As you say, a facilities set up which is top 10 Championship level in terms of the academy, the training ground, the stadium, fan base. They'll, if they do get the Championship, they'll be averaging mid-table Championship crowds, 22, 23, 24,000, that type of thing. So whilst it's going to be an interesting challenge, it will, as you say correctly, hold no fears. I mean, upper mid-table Championship is Charlton's sort of historic natural place in the food chain, and that's where they need to get back to. And the gap between League One and the Championship is much overstated by people in the Championship who observe correctly that the quality of football is higher. But the thing about League One is that actually playing against those teams who are playing on tight pitches, clogging it around, kicking it in the air, doesn't actually help the better teams. It's actually a problem for the better teams to play against that. And it can be a real relief when you step up into the Championship and you start playing every week against teams who want to play football against you, which enables you to play your football back against them. And if you look at the teams who went up the previous season from a not very strong League One, if we're being honest, this season has been a very strong League One. The previous season was not a very strong League One. Portsmouth, Derby and Oxford all stayed up with varying degrees of comfort. And as I say, none of them would be regarded as being any, certainly much bigger than Charlton in Portsmouth, and Oxford's case perhaps rather smaller than Charlton. So no fears for Charlton if they do go up. I hope, dream and believe that they will But you still have to win a football match, don't you? And that's never a given on the day.
No, and I think it's fair to say Leyton Orient, who they're playing against, upset the odds by beating Stockport. I think Stockport were fancied to go through. And Leyton Orient, certainly in all my football watching time, top of League One, top of the third tier is where they have mostly been in their good years. And they've obviously been out of the league as well. I think they've had seasons in what we now call the Championship, but not
one or two.
Not very many. Not very many.
Yeah, not very many.
So history is on the side of Charlton.
But on the day, with very little pressure on Orient, unlike Charlton, there'll be a lot of pressure on Charlton. The overwhelming preponderance of fans in the stadium will be Charlton.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that Orient will set out their allocation, whereas Charlton will set out their allocation. I remember when we went there with Sunderland to play against Charlton in the playoff final. It was the first time I slightly came a cropper with the Sunderland fans. After the game, I gave a radio interview when I was asked, how does it feel? Sunderland's such a big club. And I said, in an unguarded moment, I said, well, actually, on the day today, I thought Charlton felt like the bigger club. That they packed out their end. Sunderland didn't quite that day. And they were actually about 2 to 3 times noisier than the Sunderland fans and really, really felt and sounded like a proper big club. But that brings its own pressure. And Orient will be playing without pressure. No one expected them to get to the playoffs. No one expected them to beat Stockport. No one will be expecting them to win, so they can play without pressure. Whereas there is going to be pressure for Charlton. I felt in the semi-final against Wycombe probably weren't Charlton's best 2 performances, albeit against a tricky opponent. So they'll need to try and reclaim the style with which they were playing in the latter part of the season, and impose that on Orient, because they do have the better players, but they do need to demonstrate that on the day. In Sunderland's case, I think, most people in football would make Sheffield United the strong favourites in that game.
Yep.
I didn't think Sunderland were very good in the semi-final against Coventry. I thought over the 2 legs, Coventry were, in quotation marks, the better side.
Yeah.
And Sunderland found a way. They've got a phenomenal culture, led by Luke O'Nien, who I remember signing, and him turning up at Sunderland with his little car with all his worldly belongings packed in the back, eager look on his face. And in his first match for us, he was playing in midfield, which he almost never has played in since this day, and was subbed off at half-time in disgrace against Charlton, in fact. And since then has grown into the most extraordinary club captain, who drives the value, drives the whole values and the culture of the entire club. In a way that you just don't often see in the modern game these days. He's played more than 300 games for the club, and really has been a centerpiece of how they've been able to keep on driving forward over the last few years. But if you were to look at the 2 semi-finals, Sheffield United thrashing Bristol and Sunderland just about nurdling and nudging their way past Coventry, you'd think that Sheffield United would be the strong favourites, which in turn potentially could take a little bit of the pressure off Sunderland, and perhaps they will come out and show us something that they haven't done in the last 2 or 3 months. And if they do, it'd be absolutely fantastic. I think up in the Premier League, it will depend greatly on the quality of their recruitment. There will be money available because they will know that their revenues in the Premier League are going to be very, very large. Their match day income is going to be vast. They've got huge hospitality areas, massive merchandising. It's not just that they've got a big stadium. They've just got a huge fan base that generates massive revenues when things are heading in the right direction. So their recruitment over the last 5 years, probably, since in the first year or a year and a half, we made some mistakes, which are well documented. Also some very good moves like Luke and etc. Since I appointed Christian Speakman, the sporting director, and Stuart Harvey, the recruitment head, all those years ago, really the recruitment has been consistently good. And they've got a very young team. They've got the youngest team in the Championship. So it's not unreasonable to think that a lot of those players are still improving, heading in the right direction. So the question then will be how can they just get that little bit of experience, that little bit of know-how and nous into the team to enable some of the young improving players to keep on going? When I look at Mayenda and Isidore up front, I think you've got something there. You've got pace, you've got some real guile and some real sort of elite quality, but that is going to need to be paired with a bit of know-how, because I think as has been seen this season with Ipswich, you can have that type of team, but without having a few Premier League players who actually understand how to manage the game, you do struggle.
Yeah, well, as a keener student of the Championship than I would like to be, given West Bromwich Albion's now 4 years stay in that division, I have to say Sheffield United for me are the clear favourites, and
Yeah.
Albion actually ran them twice, ran them close twice, two very good games against Sheffield United, but I do think they are a class above. I think perhaps they were slightly flattered, Sheffield United, by the 6-0 defeat over two legs of Bristol
Yeah.
City, who I was astonished to see make the playoffs. They're one of the worst teams I've seen at the Hawthorns last season, but they still have to be beaten. But I would say Sheffield United are, for me, strong favourites, but who knows? As on the day, one-off and all that. Let's talk about Crystal Palace, Charlie, talking about one-off days. And perhaps I'm doing Crystal Palace an injustice, because I certainly think with the likes of Eberechi Eze, who is, I have to say, is one of my favourite footballers. I love to watch him play. He's also got an incredible backstory of rejection by about half a dozen clubs. And now, for me, he's one of the most exciting players in England. So I was delighted to see him get the winner against Manchester City. And I just at the start of this podcast, Charlie, mentioned the teams like Palace, kind of medium-sized or smaller teams, Leicester, who you can argue are slightly bigger than Palace, Wigan, who are definitely smaller, Portsmouth, smaller, but clubs of middling stature who've won the FA Cup have nearly all come to grief in the following seasons. Is that going to happen to Palace, do you think?
I don't think so. I think sometimes you look at a trend and you say, is there a reason behind it? And then you look at that trend and go, well, not really. I mean, Portsmouth were in a sort of financial tailspin, which had nothing to do with winning the FA Cup or not winning the FA Cup. They went down for those reasons. They went bust fundamentally.
They hideously overspent, hadn't they?
Yeah. Which I guess probably had something to do with them winning the FA Cup. The overspending probably did. But
beating West Bromwich Albion in the semi-final, I'm not bitter.
And then in Wigan's case, they were a small club batting miles above their average, and their stay in the Premier League was always going to come to an end at some point, and it happened to do so in that season. And maybe in that one particular season, there was a bit of a connection in terms of the amount of focus and effort that went into the FA Cup versus trying to stay up. So you could argue that, but do I think that Wigan would still be in the Premier League now? No, absolutely not a chance. And the other case was, sorry, just remind me, Adrian.
There was Leicester City.
Leicester, who
won the Premier League just I think 3 or 4 seasons before that, and still had the vestiges of a very good Premier League winning side.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that their subsequent decline has got anything to do with winning the FA Cup. I think it's much more a fact that it's been a poorly run club for an awful long time now, and the FA Cup was the last sort of roar of an extraordinary one-off side that came together in a moment in time. So I don't think that's the case. In Palace's case,
I mean, Palace have got wealthy American investors, haven't they? Steve Parish brought in American.
Well,
after
I know, but
it
doesn't really work that way, because effectively Steve Parish, although he only owns 8% of the club, controls the club and doesn't want to welcome in vast amounts of more money into the club, because that would dilute his own stake. So it's run in what I would call a very business-like, sensible way. I applaud it. I'm not criticising him for this at all. I guess the challenge will come with a relatively shallow squad when you start playing in all those Europa League games. Because generally speaking, they're about 10 points clear of relegation. This season, a little bit more than that. But generally speaking, they're about 10 points clear of relegation. And quite a few of those points will be picked up by playing against teams who had been playing in Europe that week, who then struggle a little bit on the weekend with all the travelling and all that type of stuff. Now, once you become that club, then there can be a bit of an overhang or hangover to that in terms of your ability to rotate, or lack of ability to rotate, compared to the other clubs you're battling against for relegation. So that'll be one to keep an eye on, that they will need to deepen their squad. They will get obviously some extra money from appearing in the Europa League. Not vast sums, but nonetheless, a meaningful amount. Certainly commercially, it will be very, very helpful. So you'd probably expect to see 20 to 30 million extra coming into the club, which should enable 2 or 3 to 4 more quality players to come in to give them that slightly greater breadth. But I actually prefer to see it as a wonderful thing, although my Charlton friends won't thank me for saying so. I think it's a wonderful thing that, again, Newcastle, my Sunderland friends won't thank me for saying so, but to see Newcastle winning the League Cup and Palace winning the FA Cup, and to see the extraordinary competition there is for everything outside the first place in the Premier League this season. You know, you've got a situation where right down to 8th, 9th place in the league, they can think about getting into Europe this year, because we'll come on to this in a moment. The number of European places that the English League is about to get is absolutely unprecedented and vast. But what we're seeing is the closing up of the mid-table up into the upper reaches of the league. And we've discussed this before in terms of Villa and Newcastle and finances, but it's also the case that the league is more consistently competitive and attracting such a consistently high level of play. I read an article the other day that I just disagree with so fundamentally that I actually screwed it up and threw it in the corner. It was by a man who regularly writes absolute rubbish, although he writes it very nicely, which means he gets away with it, called Martin Samuel.
Oh, you're Beck Noir. Poor old Martin Samuel. Martin, come on the programme. Come and put your own point of view. Go on, Martin Samuel, right in the Times, I think.
Martin Samuel just doesn't understand anything about the structure of football. So his claim was that the Premier League is a hopeless league, totally gone because it doesn't have any global Galacticos. Well, first of all, that's just patently rubbish. But leaving that to one side, the bottom line is that what's actually happened in the Premier League is that so competitive is the league that teams cannot afford to blow their budget on one or two Galacticos. They have to produce a big competitive squad, right? And that then means that, unlike in the European leagues that Martin Samuel loves so much, where basically outside the top 2 or 3 or 4 teams, no one even ever gets a look in at anything. In England, you've got a situation where genuinely they can all beat each other and win trophies. And, you know, the signal that's being sent out by Newcastle and Palace to Brighton, Brentford, Fulham, etc. is, guys, come on, it's there. We are now good enough. We are now good enough on our day to go through a cup competition and lift a trophy. We are good enough to get into Europe and get to European finals. We are, you know, like West Ham did, etc. We are at the top table now. Don't be fooled by the fact that we can't yet quite win an EPL title, which requires being super elite over 38 games. Don't be fooled into thinking that means you can't win trophies full stop. You can't compete for Europe. You can, and we are, and that is making it an unbelievably compelling competition. I mean, all right, relegation this season was an absolute no-show, and there are reasons behind that which I don't think entirely relate to financial structuring. It's more to do with the particularities of the clubs involved and their own place and moment in time and where they are, etc. We can discuss that on another day. But overall, it's been an absolutely enthralling Premier League and remains so right down to the last day. Now, you might ask me the question, how come England's getting so many places? And the answer is that UEFA runs something called the coefficient ranking, which basically says that the country with the teams that do best in European competition get more European places, and vice versa, less so. So if Martin Samuel's point was correct, that the Premier League is a busted flush with no good players and absolutely hopeless, and we should all be spending much more money and all this type of stuff, which seems to be his shtick, then effectively our coefficient would be coming down and we'd be getting fewer European places. The opposite is the case. We are at the top of that ranking, which means that we now get 5 places in the Champions League. But even going below that, because we're guaranteed to win the Europa Leagues, by we I say rather grandly, an English team is guaranteed to win the Europa League. That means that team is also guaranteed a place in the Champions League. So that means we're going to have an unprecedented, and by unprecedented, I mean it's never happened before. One country is going to have 6 teams in the Champions League next season, right? 6 Premier League teams in the Champions League next season, which then means that you've then got the Europa League places and the Europa Conference League places going down from there to the point where 8 and even potentially 9 English teams could be in Europe next season if certain things work out in a certain way. This podcast isn't long enough to explain exactly what all those various permutations are. So I see that Palace win as being part of a broader trend towards the mid-table of the Premier League becoming globally competitive clubs. We've spoken before, haven't we, about how West Ham is the 17th richest club on the planet, right? That is what is enabling all of this. That is what is driving all of this, is the broader spread of wealth through the Premier League and the broader spread of expertise through the Premier League. And that's why over time they are gradually crunching the leagues that Martin Samuel thinks are so wonderful.
Well, I think as well, I wonder, Charlie, whether, ironically, there is a long-term backlash against the European Super League in that UEFA recognise that threat, and you and I have spoken about the fact that the possibility of a European Super League that is in some senses a breakaway from UEFA has not disappeared. UEFA are trying to head that off by growing their competitions, creating more matches, therefore more broadcasting revenue, more attendance in the stadium, and so on. And English clubs seem to be best placed to be the beneficiaries of that. And that in turn then may be having an impact on our Premier League. More clubs getting more money as well as the Premier League share out in order to be competitive with the top clubs.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. I'm sure that wasn't the intention of the exercise by UEFA, but that is part of what's happening. And as I said, I think that the English Premier League is becoming, dare I say it, better and better and better, more and more competitive. And the depth of talent and the depth of squads is getting to the point where even mid-table clubs can compete in Europe and still maintain their place in the Premier League. And that is going to be Palace's big challenge next year, is can they combine those two things together and sort of platform off the back of it and use the additional money to, effectively become even better. Like Charlton, they've got a great academy, which is always going to be a big assistance to them, and very efficiently well-run club, etc. But the moment of truth now approaches, which is they've been eking out their existence in the Premier League for a long time now, a decade or so, constantly finishing about 14th, 15th, 16th, that type of thing, without playing European football, without really advancing in cup competitions all that much. And now they are in that moment in time where they're going to have to play a lot of matches under a lot of pressure, and they need to stay in the Premier League. I hope they will, because I think that will show other clubs that you can go for it in cup competitions. I think one thing that you and I have bemoaned over recent times is when clubs sort of think, well, let's field weakened teams in cup competitions because it helps us in the league, which is really sad for those of us who love cup competitions. So I really hope that Palace prove to all clubs that actually winning the FA Cup, and Newcastle prove that winning the League Cup is just an unalloyed good, and something that all of these clubs should be aiming for, perhaps with a little bit more enthusiasm than they have been up to this point.
Hear to that, and certainly, I'm slightly more jaundiced about the Newcastle success given their Saudi owners, but I think Crystal Palace is a wonderful moment for English football. Great players and traditional club, medium-sized. So as a West Brom fan, I look at that and think,
yeah, it gives us all hope.
If they can do it, couldn't we? Absolutely.
Exactly right. And that's a crucial part of the pyramid, isn't it? Which is that all the fans of all clubs need to believe that they have hope.
Absolutely. Charlie, thank you. Good luck to all of your teams at the weekend, Mount Pleasant, Sunderland and Charlton. And well done, Palace. Thanks to Mark Machado for his work on this episode of Where's the Money Gone? Mark handles our socials or some of our socials. And I do some of them as well, and puts us up on YouTube. So thank you to Mark for that. And if you've enjoyed this episode, do subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple. Do leave us a positive review if you can. And tell a friend as well, because nothing beats personal recommendation. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening. Cheers now. Bye-bye.